You remember Din Ben Phu? No. The same thing happened in Algeria, in Africa. They didn't have anything but a rifle. The French had all these highly mechanized instruments of warfare, but they put some guerrilla action on.
Hello and welcome to Guerrilla History, the podcast that acts as a reconnaissance report of global proletarian history and aims to use the lessons of history to analyze the present. I'm your host, Henry Hakamaki, joined by one of my usual co-hosts, Professor Adnan Husain, historian and director of the School of Religion at Queen's University in Ontario, Canada. Hello, Adnan. How are you doing today?
I'm well, Henry. It's great to be with you.
Yeah, it's always nice seeing you. I feel like it's been a little while since I've seen you, but I'm always happy to see you here, and I really like the conversations that we have every time that we get together. Unfortunately, we're not joined by our other regular co-host, Breht O'Shea, who is celebrating his birthday. So happy birthday, Breht. Congratulations on turning the ripe old age of whatever it is now, 24 or something like that. Happy birthday. We all wish you a good day and hope that you enjoy it with friends and family. But we do have an excellent guest to join us today. And instead of me introducing the guest, and I probably should have warned you ahead of time that you were going to do this, Adnan, but would you mind introducing our guest since it is a colleague of yours?
Oh, with pleasure. This is a great friend and colleague who I've known for, I don't know, a couple of decades or more at this point. And I'm really delighted because she teaches a history of capitalism course that I think we'll be talking about that issue today with her. But she is Dr. Ariel Salzmann from Queen's University's History Department. And she's author of a very interesting study on the Ottoman state and state formation. And is also completing a study on exclusion in the history of the West, and is a world historian, has taught our world history pre-modern survey course for first years and all kinds of other topics like commodities in global history, and takes a very global materialist historical perspective that I think listeners will really benefit from. So I really want to welcome friend and colleague Ariel Salzmann. Thanks for coming on the show, Ariel.
Thanks so much, Henry and Adnan. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a pleasure. And I've enjoyed listening to you speak on the Majlis several times before. I always enjoy when Adnan, as well as the other people at, let me see if I can get the acronym right, MSGPQU. Did I get that right, Adnan?
That's right.
Okay. Every time your colleagues there bring on Dr. Salzmann, it's always a fascinating conversation. And it's really a pleasure to be able to speak with you now, Dr. Salzmann.
Well, thank you. Mutual. The feeling is mutual.
Thank you very much. So we have a really interesting conversation coming up today. As Adnan mentioned, you do a course on the history of capitalism. And we are also planning on talking a lot about world systems theory, or as Andre Gunther Frank would put it, the world system, without the hyphen and in the singular tense. So I think that we'll talk about that quite a bit during this conversation as well. But instead of me, just saying things that I'm thinking that we're going to talk about, why don't I just turn it over to you, Professor Salzmann, and you can start the conversation however you would like to, and we can just start bouncing off of each other after that.
Okay. I've been teaching this course on the history of capitalism for a long time, and I keep getting different waves of students with different backgrounds, having gone through different analyses or what they assume to be capitalism or what they can assume to be the debates. But it brings me back to this moment, and Adnan and I were both teaching at NYU at New York University, when a colleague of ours decided to bring Andre Gunther Frank. Andre Gunther Frank is very well known in left economics. He was part of dependency theory, which basically said that Latin America and the rest of the so-called third world, the global south, had been trapped in basically a traction belt from capitalism and imperialism that harnessed all their resources almost without able to break free, with no ability to break off into European capitalism or Western capitalism more generally. And so he had been part of that school. the Monthly Review crowd. Some people might know the folks there. And he'd written some brilliant articles and discussions. And then he retooled and he decided, wow, this is really Eurocentric. Our version of capitalism to begin with is very Eurocentric. And he started reading broadly, and it took him first to China. And then at the end of his life, if you look on his website, because he was outside the academy at that point, he was actually working on Central Asia, and he was going way, 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 way back. So he's trying to find the origins of a transition, but also the way that capital and global systems of commerce had built up by the year 1600. And he wrote a book that had just come out at the time that he gave the lecture that was called Reorient, Asia in the Global Age. I'm messing up the first title, the whole title, but it's Reorient. And it was, for him, it was reorientation of his whole formation as a classically trained economist who then, after studying with the infamous Milton Friedman at the University of Chicago, made a complete left turn, and then, joined this dependency theory school, spent a long time in Latin America. And he presented the basis for his new book, which basically said, up till 1700, the West was not there. It was all Asia. It was all China. China was an industrial powerhouse, just churning out manufacturers. And it's only through, a series of coincidences, but it actually was refueled by the Americas, because most of the silver from the Americas actually ended up in China. And it produced a very dynamic situation. Well, at the end of his lecture, most of the people in the audience were just stunned, because whether they were left or centrist or whatever, they had grown up on this history of capitalism that was all centered around the West, and the Industrial Revolution that came out of England and was, the product of European ingenuity, European, everything, culture, property rights. All this accrued to, European civilization, and had nothing to do with any other part of the world. If anything, oh yes, we had a few plantations in the Americas, and that helped out. But otherwise, the Industrial Revolution stood by itself, and from there you get the history of the world, and too bad, too sad, Asia, Africa, and the rest. And so, there was this total disconnect and this back and forth. And what I started realizing was two things from that conversation. First of all, I was already, in the mix of some of those discussions. But I think the biggest takeaway was how little people knew about the development of capitalism within Europe. It wasn't just that they didn't know anything about Asia or how dominant China had been in the global system at that age, at that period in time, 16th, 17th century. And according to a more recent historical study, actually was coming out around the same time. And Andre Gunther Frank was having conversations with this scholar, whose name is Kenneth Pomerantz. Basically, Pomerantz is arguing, and has been arguing, that the turning point in the world economy was really 1800, and that China and the West were on track, neck and neck, as to which side of the world was going to industrialize first. And he had an answer for that. We can go into that. But all that to say is that it is not a clear-cut, trajectory of the development of capitalism. And as Gunther Frank would go on to talk about this, it's not even clear when capitalism started.
I'm going to hop in here for a second, Professor,
sure.
if you don't mind, because I think that before we even start talking about what is capitalism, when did capitalism start, where did capitalism start, getting some definitions on a couple of things that are going to orient the listeners as to how we're approaching this topic may be useful. So you mentioned dependency theory. It might be useful for the listeners if you first briefly explain what is dependency theory, what is world systems theory, what is core, what is periphery, just some of these basic terms that are definitely going to come up in the conversation to come, because after that point, we're going to start talking about what is capitalism, where did capitalism begin, was the surplus value created, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We're going to have a very long conversation about this. So it might be useful for the listeners to at least be briefly acquainted with some of the terms and concepts that we're going to be talking about.
Okay, so let's backpedal to the 60s and the original definitions that come out of Marx, right? And of course, for Marx, a lot of it was linked to the Industrial Revolution. Before that, there was commercial capitalism, commercial commerce, trade, there was imperialism, but it's really the Industrial Revolution. And even in Marxian theory, it's more of a change in scale and intensification than it is of a net difference between the type of market systems that preceded it. Fast forward, lots of debates within Marxian thought about this. And during the 1960s especially, there was a great deal of ferment. Because why was that? Well, decolonization was happening, and people were trying to plot out different plans, of how to deal with a system that was already there around them and had extracted resources from them during the whole colonial period and beyond. And so dependency theory came out of that discussion of how, what was at stake, what were the sets of relationships, were they changeable? And dependency theory basically said that because of the prehistory of the way that capitalism harnessed, or imperialism and capitalism together, it's hard to say the cart and the horse in this particular case, because of that individual states were locked into a trajectory of dependence to the global economy. And then the question was how to break that dependence. Because most of these countries, it would be one or two resources, agrarian, extractive, and sugar, minerals of various sorts, diamonds here, rubber in Congo, and how to break that link and to reconfigure the domestic economy in order to create greater autonomy. Not necessarily socialism, but of course that would be the end game in all of this. So it was a system of analysis. And out of that came a variety of debates and discussions that took Marx's theory on another level. And one of those was the theories of an anthropologist who was working in Africa, whose name was Emanuel Wallerstein. He hung out with a lot of the people. He just died in 2019. He hung out with a lot of the people who were involved in liberation struggles, anti-colonial struggles. He had a set of partners. Terry Hopkins was one. He came out of McGill University, also an anthropologist. And they were really good friends with someone named Giovanni Arrighi, who is now, he died in 2009. And they started having a discussion. And they ended up at Binghamton, what's now called Binghamton University, setting up a new center and rethinking capitalism in different terms. And the terms that they started thinking about capitalism were basically these. That capitalism still was a system that started in Europe and building on a new sort of history of economic history that came out of Europe. They decided that it started in the 16th century in Europe and that it evolved in stages. And it had a series, and I'm not going to say they're concentric, but let's think of them as concentric circles in which different parts of this evolving capitalist system benefited differentially from the other parts, the other intersecting circles. So at the very core of that was the core. And originally, they saw the core as not stable, but moving around depending on where the concentration of capital was. The original core, of course, Italy, and then moved north. And the core depended on agrarian products coming from further afield in what they would call the semi-periphery, and usually very close in terms of space. And then there was a larger world of the periphery, where the world that was colonized, that would be colonized, and during the process of colonialism and imperialism, where that part of the world became basically the resource basket for the core, and capitalism evolved in this setting where, of course, everything being unequal, and it's talked about in other terms. We talk about it in terms of mercantilism, but they reformulated this as a long-term system that continues to this day, with a core that moves around the world depending on where the locus of economic concentration is and the extractive capacities are. I hope that helps your listeners to think about that. So from dependency theory, and people have castigated what is called the world systems theory, that was sort of developed by Wallerstein, Hopkins, and Arrighi. They criticized it being sort of, it's just about commerce, and it's not enough about transformations on the ground. Where are peasants? Where are peasant revolts? Where is feudalism in this whole debate? And of course, certain Marxian notions, feudal mode of production, Asiatic mode of production, are sort of thrown out the window in this. So there was a lot of debate among Marxists about whether this was a legitimate interpretation. But it's continued until this day. There's a world system school in sociology. Actually, it's located in sociology rather than economics. And there are adherents and contributors to this theory that go on. And it's evolved. The theory has evolved in different directions, some of which have gone in the direction of more environmental history. But that's something else we can talk about.
So, Ariel, you've put a lot up there on the table, and you've introduced this kind of historical sociology, historical political economy that gave rise to thinking about a world system having been created, over the last 500 years with the emergence of what we're calling, according to this classic narrative, capitalism. So the world systems theory was basically, it sounds like from your description, a way of taking the Marxist analysis of the emergence of capitalism and trying to look at how that maps out onto the world. But you mentioned Andre Gunder Frank's kind of revisionist and rather, unbalancing kind of perspective in response to this world system theory coming out of dependency theory, then looking at it historically, that he suggested that instead of a 500-year world system that emerges with the rise of capitalism and with the dominance of a kind of Western political power over the globe in an era of colonialism and imperialism that is described by that period of 500 years, that instead there wasn't just some emergence of it 500 years ago, but argues for a world system that precedes the emergence of what we're thinking of capitalism or Western dominance. And so it totally reframes things. I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about that reframing and what some of the implications are in terms of his analysis, where it shifts the analysis.
Okay, but I also want to put this, being a historian, I apologize, put this, in some sort of order, because Gunder Frank, we are 1998. The world systems theory is being developed in the 1960s and 70s, right? So he is critiquing that previous reformulation of Marxian analysis. And between those two, there are other critiques that are coming out, or just about to come out, of world systems theory as a sort of later iteration of Marxian analysis. And they start pushing, and I think it has a lot to do with, and it may seem to be off track, Orientalism, and the critique of Orientalism, the cultural critique that finds its way into Marxian analysis, and it finds its way into material critique. And so there's this gradual recognition that I think is percolating through intellectual orientations that leads to some sort of revision and critique of what essentially is, from Marx onward, a very Eurocentric version of capitalist development, right? So it's not like Wallerstein broke with that. It's not like Braudel, from whom he's a great historian, broke from that. They're all very Eurocentric. And it's actually the cultural critique that I think influences the way that economists, critical economists, and Marxian economists start looking around and saying, whoa, wait a second, maybe there's more to the story. And once we throw out the sort of traditional Marxian model, maybe we have to go further afield. And in the case of Andre Gunther Frank, and I think he lobs the Molotov cocktail into this whole way of thinking because of his stature in leftist economics. And he engages in a long-term debate with Wallerstein. It's very personal on some levels, arguing that first and foremost, there's no sort of way to place Europe in the center of this world in 1600. It doesn't start there, he says. It just doesn't. The second thing he starts to realize as he pushes the clock backward is that it's very hard to be a little bit capitalistic. That commercial capitalism and industrial capitalism are, coexist. They're contemporaries all the way through this process, supposedly of industrialization. That feudalism, all sorts of other forms of extraction are there. And that when we trace the thread back of where were the first markets, how was capital rationalized, and we're looking especially at merchant capital as opposed to agrarian capital, which Wallerstein was doing, then you've got to go back to basically Sumer, and that's where the 5,000 years starts coming in, and the sort of moving away from defining capitalism as a fixed notion to talking about either one or many systems that fed into the world as we know it today. The exploitation, differential wealth, and the prospects of the world's populations, given this inequality of wealth and access to everything, and as we know now, obviously to healthcare. So I hope that was a little more. Maybe Henry will tease out some more of this. Yes.
Well, I mean, there's so much to say. There's so many ways that we could go with this. But I guess before I continue talking about world system and Gunther Frank, I'm curious about one thing it's totally an aside, so feel free to be really brief on this. Yeah. But, we like segues and whatnot. And Adnan, I'd also like your opinion on this as well. We talked about Eurocentrism already. And of course, Eurocentrism is something that undoubtedly has been a hindrance to proper analysis of of world history, first of all, of the world interstate commerce system, the economy of the globe. This Eurocentrism that we've really been ingrained with for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years has been a major hindrance to analysis. But And again, this is an aside, there's been some really interesting discussions that have been going on recently, and I can highlight a couple of pieces that were put out from the review of African Political Economy that looked at Marx and Lenin specifically, and was arguing against dismissing them as being completely Eurocentrist in their analyses. So there was a piece that came out a few years ago from Bico Agazzino in Rope titled The Africana Paradigm in Capital, The Debts of Karl Marx to the People of African Descent. And then there was a follow-up that just came out less than a month ago from Joe Pateman titled The Centrality of Africa and Lenin's Theory of Imperialism, which were both very interesting pieces. And I think I think that there is quite a bit in them that is convincing that, these thinkers that a lot of these theorists were basing their theories on actually did consider some of these future advancements that we would have in thought, things like, without naming it, unequal exchange, things like, again, without naming it, the core versus periphery paradigm. But I mean, Lenin's theory of imperialism really was based on this, without naming it explicitly, because the terms did not exist at that time. But at the same time, it's also true that then the people that took those theories that were being put out by Marx and Lenin, and of course those theories that were advanced had a preponderance of evidence based from Europe, because that is the evidence that was available to them when they were making their theories, right? But those theories were then taken up by future theorists who then continued to only look at European contexts, even when more evidence from other regions of the world came out. So again, this is an aside. Feel free to be brief on this, because I do want to get back to the main topic of conversation, but just out of curiosity.
I think you're absolutely right. The fact is that one can take from Marx and Lenin, various things. I think speaking as an Ottoman historian and someone specializing in that part of Asia that was not directly colonized by the West and was put in a sort of separate category by Marx called the Asiatic mode of production. And it was sort of like a box that, people in the region, people outside of the region try to, get out of and understand. From my perspective, Orientalism was a very welcome critique that highlighted that aspect of Marx. But there's no question that Marx saw, even when he talked derisively, and some parts of it were sarcastic, about China. He was appalled by it too, I mean, when he, in his journalistic accounts, he's appalled by imperialism. But he saw this longer, forward-thinking trajectory that that capitalism would eventually be defeated and imperialism with it, right? So it wasn't anti-Chinese, anti-African as such, but it did raise questions when we look back in history, questions of origin that become also invested. There are things that invested that are parts of cultural claims. And so capitalism and the origins of capitalism, of market systems, of private property, and all these, supposedly good stuff, who lays claims to them has cultural currency as well as intellectual, purity and, or, political agendas tied to them. So, that's what I'll have to say about that.
Adnan, is there anything that you want to add to that before I get us back onto track?
Well, I mean, I think that is a track, is to think about this question here about the Eurocentrism of our explanations up to this point. And so one of the things that seems that's very intriguing about what Ariel's been talking about is not only expanding the scale of time in which you're talking about capital accumulation operating in history and functioning in a kind of systemic way, but also expanding the geography, right, for where these effects or consequences, where you have to look in history to see the sources of change within a dynamic, global system. So I think that's useful. I mean, I think two things that Ariel said that I think would be worth thinking about a little bit more and hearing her on is, one, she sort of said is that even the explanations and understanding internally in the history of Europe for capitalism, and let's add the corollary that one of the other kinds of historical questions that have framed Eurocentric approaches and histories is, well, why did the West become a dominant, kind of grouping within, the history of the world in the last, 500 years? When did that happen? How did that happen? And a lot of the theories, of course, were, making all kinds of presumptions about the sources of this or the extent of the hegemony and so on. So that all has to be critiqued, and maybe there is something to distinguish between the history of capitalism as a whole and how we would understand that. And, different periods of hegemony in history and its sources and bases. And one thing that the Eurocentric narratives, whether they've been, kind of a certain form of Marxism or whether they've been these very right-wing kind of, historiographies about the unique internal cultural values of Europe that spurred its, dynamism and so on, that all of them seem to have kind of associated whatever occurs in the modern, system of West, modernity as, a product of some sort of trajectory that is located within Europe, but doesn't, take into account the wider perspective, or in the case that we've been talking about, a longer perspective. And so that's why I was asking about what are the consequences of changing that frame to a longer framework. And I'd like to hear Ariel talk a little bit more about that, but also, so it's not only the time scale that changes the way you look at things. Certain things come into focus. Certain things that look like they're unique products of a particular time suddenly don't look so unique, and so you have to change your analysis. And then likewise, the geographic kind of axis of it. That if you're focused on explaining, why did Europe become, you may, come up with explanations that aren't based in, the genuine facts that you are not viewing because you're not looking at what's happening in the rest of the world. You're only looking at it as an adjunct to some other system or process. So those are the kind of two axes I think your question gets at in terms of the Eurocentrism, is that there's a unique Eurocentric sense of its own history that might be mythic and needs to be critiqued. And then likewise, it's, geographically very narrow and is missing a lot of what's happening.
If I may, if that wasn't a big enough question already, I'm going to add another axis onto this. So Adnan, you said we need to not only broaden the scope geographically that we're looking at history, as well as lengthen the period of time that we're looking at history. But I think that there's another fundamental block that there's quite some debate on within dependency theory itself, is what is moving history. So we don't only have the how long and the how wide, we also have the why or the how question as well. So talking about some of these dependency theorists, we have Wallerstein, who Professor Salzmann, you already introduced. We have Samir Amin, who is a dependency theorist that I'm quite fond of myself, that say basically politics and ideology are the driving motive forces of history. Whereas we have Günter Frank, who we've already talked about quite a bit, at least somewhat in this conversation. He really narrows it down to capital accumulation as the motive force of history unto itself, even in the pre-capitalist period. So this is why I'm adding it onto this question, because Adnan is talking about, broadening the scope of history, both in terms of geography and time. In terms of what Günter Frank is talking about, he sees capital accumulation as the motive force of history, even pre-capitalism. He has this work, the 5,000-year world system, where he's talking about how the process of capital accumulation is driving it for that, basically that entire period. So just another axis to throw in there on that question. You have not only the time and the geography, but also the how or the why things are actually changing.
Okay. So I think, if we can strike a very contemporary chord, Thomas Piketty, has addressed this again about the ideology of capitalism and its self-justification. And of course, that was the mission civilisatrice of the 19th century. And yes, you'll have all this self-justification. So in a way, one can think of all of European history, I'll say this as one big justification of global dominance, and not just the Whiggish part of it. So just the whole imbalance of what we know about Europe versus what we know about the majority of the world, So, so the ideological is there. And I think the question here is perhaps getting away from the term capitalism. And the more I teach about the history, I don't want to shock you in this, but the more I teach about the capitalism, the more I begin to think that this is not a very useful term, and that and again going back to the Marxian concept that that scale, that quantity changes into quality, and so, but how that quantity occurs. That pushes the scale over into capitalism. I think that becomes a topic that is increasingly difficult to address once we understand the 2 points that Adnan was talking about. One is the geographical scale of accumulation, which is Samir Amin, accumulation on a global scale, right? And then we have the time lapse, which is when does this begin? When did that scale start shifting from one hemisphere to another, and how? And here, the timing, I think becomes for me is becoming very interesting. Is the way that in terms of accumulation and in terms of global dominance, several things intersect at different moments in history. And if I can just give a plug to my old professor, Richard Bullitt, whose book on, I think it's Cotton, Climate, and Camels, wrote a book on the 9th century about 200 years of history using very scant resources. Obviously, the resources that weren't available to Günter Frank or to Marx, much less, and reconstructs a little moment in history where everything in Turkish denk oldu, everything came together. Climate came together, culture came together, technology came together, and there was this efflorescence of commercialization of cotton in Iran, where you don't think about, commercialization. The underground qanat, the underground tunnel system was dug. Muslims came, we became increasingly dominant. There was a demand for cotton because, traditionally Muslims have shunned other luxury fabrics. So this expanding market for cotton. The Muslims also restored lands that had been marginalized through these underground water systems, irrigation systems. And so increasingly, I'm seeing these sort of moments in history where things came together. And I think Bullitt's little example, it's still 200 years, is very instructive. And more people are looking at, there's a new book out by De Groot, relatively new, on, he's a historian of the Netherlands and the Dutch Golden Age. And he looks at climate and, what was hell for the rest of the world, called, the Little Ice Age, was great for the Dutch. And they prospered during this moment. They had the right technology. They were in the right place at the right time. What destroyed whole economies during this period and was particularly destructive for the Mediterranean, as we learn, this period from about 1300 to 1800, which is called the Little Ice Age, where temperatures plummeted by more than 1 degree Celsius, certain regions became backwaters and other regions became cores, to borrow the terminology of Wallerstein and company. So, it's again, I think one of the refreshing things about this debate between Gunther Frank and Wallerstein, and as I said, it became like really personal. It was back and forth. No, 500 years, 5,000 years. And I mean, come on, he comes up with that term like add another decimal to your thing. I mean, it's more exaggerated and sarcastic. But I think what's been so healthy about it is it's gotten us away from that rigidity of naming. And started us thinking, because it's impossible to get us out of that narrow tunnel vision of seeing capitalism with a capital C, as it's associated with this very specific trajectory that is Eurocentered, and comes out of Europe, benefits Europe overwhelmingly, keeps them on track, whether the narrative is celebratory or the narrative is critical. It's still there, and it prevents us from seeing both the global shifts that occur, over long periods of time, and also, and I think we were going to talk about this at some point, the possibilities that occur in different moments in time and also different places. So I'll leave it there.
Yeah, briefly before, Adnan, I let you follow up with whatever you want. Just out of curiosity, so again, we can be brief here. This book by de Groot that you mentioned, I have not read it myself.
Dagmar de Groot, called Frigid Golden Age.
Okay, Yeah, my question about this, so the way that you explain it, or the way that you summarize the work, makes me think of a lot of works that we have that I find quite problematic, which are environmentally determinist or resource determinist in terms of understanding of history. So, I mean, the key and the most obvious example for most people of this would be Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel. Yeah. I'm just curious because I haven't read the book and I'm not familiar with it. Is this determinist in a environmentally or resource dependent way? And whether or not it is, do you also see that as like a big impediment to understanding of the interconnections of different nations as well as imperialism generally? Because I find that to be a big problem in a lot of history accounts.
I listen. Jared Diamond is a popularizer of different things, and he caught a wave, and he's been riding that wave for a long time. But the environmental history, I think, is at the forefront of economic history at this point, and it is very specific. It takes into consideration technology, location. The Dutch are a perfect example of, they don't succeed, right? So it's not, and they don't succeed because of climate, but they do rise they have that, the technology, everything comes together at a certain moment in history. It doesn't sustain it. It doesn't determine it. There could have been political decisions or lack thereof, that of a whole range of contingencies. These don't happen. But I find that, this is definitely an area where we can expand our understanding of capitalism. We can understand our understanding of capitalism as a global phenomenon and how different parts of the world are able to do better at different times. I don't see, this is not environmental determinism. And it is an economic history, and it tells. Some of the best economic histories of late, the sort of ones that are pushing the envelope, as far as I'm concerned, are people like Gregory Cushman. Again, they're talking environment, guano, bird shit, the opening of the Pacific, and de Groot also talks about, it's like, why are we talking about whales? So the non-human animal component. We know about that, the fur trade in Russia, the fur trade in the Americas. But I mean, think about whales. I mean, they were a huge source of everything, oil, before petroleum, etc. So, and Jason Moore has some nice sort of short anecdotes. He's also environment world systems guy, who's now at Binghamton, and has written a fantastic book. I really have to plug it. Very, very easy read, wonderful, with Raj Patel, called The History of the World in 7 Cheap Things. And it's a fantastic book. But he talks about the llamas, these small camelid animals that were used, by the thousands and destroyed in mining Potosi in Bolivia, and the silver mines there. So, there wasn't enough horses that Europeans could bring or enough donkeys. They used local, animal life, domesticated animals. And without it, you wouldn't have hauled away all that silver. So I think environmental history is much more sophisticated. I mean, Jared Diamond does it a really disservice. He's not a historian. I have to say that. And it does a really disservice. And some of the best histories coming out of the economy are actually termed as environmental histories or climate history. But I think climate is now putting the discussion on another timetable. And that's very important. And the fact that climate shifts, some of which are global, many of which have regional variations, affect different regions very differently, has nuanced this discussion in a whole nother way. And it's very materialist. I mean, we're talking about the environment, we're talking, it might not be capital accumulation as such, but it's the material environment in which human beings are trying to extract that surplus or transform in some way.
Yeah, I think you said something that might confuse or be provocative and intriguing, for listeners, which was about how you think increasingly perhaps kind of the analytical category or the historical category of capitalism isn't necessarily the most useful way to understand this. Maybe you could expand a little bit on what that means. That how does this look to a historian like yourself who teaches a class called History of Capitalism? Like, what does it mean then to, how else do you frame or imagine what's happening in the world and, how hegemony is working, how exchange is working? If you get rid of that concept of just the narrow understanding of the label of capitalism, what then are you really able to focus on and to see? What becomes clear if you don't have to decide whether it fits this kind of conventional idea of trying to find out the history of when capitalism started and so on? What does that allow you to do?
I think the utility of a word named capitalism is that we have something to talk about. And we have something to debate, and there are a series of explanations, right? And I think, but increasingly, I see it giving diminishing returns, precisely because what really needs to happen, and I think, economists do this, and to some degree, many social scientists, they'll work that paradigm, right? And I think that we've gotten a very fast and loose way of talking about capitalism being everywhere, everything, and yet have lost the big debates that in some ways, were opened up by Gunther Frank and Wallerstein, but have closed because people haven't pursued them. I think we could refine the term, but it's gotten so abused. And on one side, and on the other side, it's been so, it's been taken as such dogma, and unfortunately some of the, the leftist, orthodoxies have contributed to that. This is capitalism, this is not capitalism, and then what falls out of that are policies and this and that. And that's, in many cases, some cases has proved to be disastrous. In other cases has led to street battles, as I know in Turkey, about defining whether Turkey was capitalist or not capitalist, or the Ottoman Empire was an Asiatic mode of production versus a feudal mode of production. So I think there's a way in which that terminology, has been at one time at once stymieing of a debate. On the other side, as long as that debate was, really rigorous and people really engaged it, and that way, even though my critique of world systems remains, and I sort of would position myself more on the side of the Günther Front, I appreciate the fact that the world systems folks keep going, because I think you have to work a paradigm to really get and very consistently have some consistent terms. And it is a sort of, it's a social scientific inquiry as opposed to the type of inquiry and descriptive studies that have been coming out that have called themselves histories of capitalism, or call themselves histories of alternative histories of the Industrial Revolution. But, are what Goitein, the famous scholar of the medieval Jewish Geniza records, called iconographic. They're sort of describing economic phenomenon, but they're not really locating it within a very consistent definition of what they call capitalism. So I think there's a use for capitalism as a concept, as something that we can debate and discuss and try to define. But it's countered by the capitalism becomes a reified category, and the sort of more, fashionable discussion of capitalism that's happening all across the academy, with everyone coming up with a new idea about American capitalism, guns and capitalism, guns and the Industrial Revolution, that is so uneconomic in the way that it's being approached. It's much more just a sort of cultural, historically rich, nuanced sort of description of certain type of economic activity without really getting to the heart of what is capitalism.
Well, I guess that's why I was asking about it, is less about like the problems of the way it's being used than if you don't have to adhere to that kind of conceptual apparatus, both on either pole that you were describing, of either this very permissive, non-materialist, more culturalist kind of way of describing versus the narrow, very specific mode of production kind of analysis, that if you don't deal with those because they're not really going to be accurate or useful in understanding history on a global long scale, as you're interested in doing, I guess what I'm more interested is less those concerns than what does one focus analysis on? Is it really a history of inequality and exploitation? Is it a history of various different forms of accumulation and the consequences of accumulation? It seems like that these would be interesting to have a kind of rigorous sense of, in a more global historical sense, because one of the advantages, I guess you would say, one of the advantages of the world system theory, or even of the Eurocentric, more narrow Marxist theory, is that, well, at least in identifying capitalism as a particular mode of production that emerges in history at a particular time, that's described by regime of wage labor as a kind of a requirement for the way it defines it, is that at least it gave some kind of a sense of where do you target energy in an analysis in seeing the end of such an exploitative system. Is that, well, okay, you just got to get rid of the commodification of labor where surplus value is derived, and then you could socialize the gains of production, or so that was like what was attractive in this, is that when you're talking about liberation and social struggles for equalities, well, it gave you something, right? So I guess my question is where do you locate this now? Because one of the concerns, if you see a 5,000-year system that emerges with cities and markets, in what we often consider prehistory, and if it's just subsequent history is reformulations and different moves for where the core and the periphery are, that it doesn't give people a horizon for what it is that needs to change in order to bring in a sustainable, environmentally and socially equitable kind of system, right? So I'm wondering what you think about that kind of problem.
Yes, there is a need for a sort of handle, on this kind of economic order, however we define the economy, this economic order that has basically swallowed us up, and swallowing the planet up. But at the same time, and I teach it, and I teach it as a problem, as a problem of terminology, as a problem of origins. Sometimes I teach it, before 5,000 BC. The James C. Scott's book, Against the Grain. James C. Scott is a famous anthropologist and of Southeast Asia, actually, and he's written some brilliant works. But this latest one is very interesting, and sort of goes back to the origins of habitus and nomadic versus settled populations, et cetera, et cetera. So, all these things I think are ingredients. And perhaps in terms of analysis, I think what the newer ways to address capitalism have harnessed our greater awareness of these other features, global, that there's, it's necessary to understand that, even, in the traditional narrative with Columbus sailing over the Atlantic, that his compass was Chinese and his navigational techniques were Arab and Muslim, right? So there's this accumulation that occurs en route that has to be acknowledged. There's another side of this too that really points to the relationship between capitalism and environmental degradation. And here I would, cite the work of Robert Marx, who writes on China and South China on a very long durée, talks about 500 years and shows how commercialization, not capitalism as we see it, in a more pristine sense, or, European capitalism coming into the Chinese market, how it's already working terrible impact on the indigenous populations of South China as North Chinese, Han Chinese move into the South, and how it destroys the environment and the wildlife, and transforms the environment without, silk is commodified, rice is commodified, but no capitalism as such. So I think it's constantly, I think that's one of the great things about Marx. I don't think, he would have been satisfied if he saw all this new literature to say, okay, there are certain things that I continue to teach about Marx, whether it is the commodity and thinking about the commodity and the fetishism of commodity, certain modes of analysis that he derived from a particular stage and a particular location of observing the economy at work in this transitional phase, where he's seeing the origins of this industrial economy and seeing it dovetail with expanding imperialism. And these are so valuable for our critique and our understanding. But, the empirical basis of which we're constantly transforming, and we can come back to that original definition and then start tweaking it and tweaking it, tweaking it. And then it becomes more useful. Going back to Piketty, in terms of policy, what should we be talking about? And he's very historical. I mean, he's a group of economists that have gathered a huge database. These aren't just, some, a few, things from the Treasury, floating monetary, analysis. I mean, this is like long-term analysis of wealth accumulation in the early 20th century, late 21st, in the early 21st and late 20th century, to show how accumulation's working on a global scale in terms of, populations themselves. I mean, he's talking about, in terms of policy, a 90% wealth tax, inheritance tax, as the only way to address the type of inequality that we have today, which isn't narrowly concentrated. That's the difference. How many, I mean, we used to talk about how many millionaires there were, right? Now, middle class are millionaires, most of them, in the United States, and even in Canada and in Europe. Just their housing values, what they've inherited as a house is half of that, right? So now we're talking about billionaires. So how, in this way in which capitalism has perpetuated itself by a limited amount of redistribution, but substantive enough to sustain it ideologically and politically. And this is as true in China as it is in the United States, and that's the big, policy of, the Chinese is really to build up that middle class, consuming middle class that is, vested in this particular, variant of capitalism. So we constantly got to reevaluate it because it didn't end. It didn't end when we hoped it would. It wasn't overthrown regionally or globally. And it's like a terrible weed that keeps, cropping up over and over and over again. So some part of our analysis we got wrong, and so it's time to go back over it. Again, for listeners and people who want to discuss and see this debate, or some of it in a very long time frame and more nuanced in terms of the environment, again, I really recommend that book by Raj Patel and Jason Moore called The History of the World in 7 Cheap Things. And just one last comment here. Jason Moore suggests that, in merging capitalism with our environmental history, he's got a big debate with the Anthropocene folks. The Anthropocene, of course, is a term that's becoming more widely accepted, and it was brought forward by environmentalists and environmental historians to designate basically the world since the Industrial Revolution that has radically transformed the environment and should be looked at as a new geological age in the history of the world, right? Moore says, no, we should call it the capital OC, because it's not human beings per se, every human being. It's a certain group of human beings harnessed to a certain a mode of economic exploitation that is in the course of completely destroying our planet. And so it should be called that. I have a comment on that, however, and I think he's more to the point. It's the cheapo-cene. Actually, it might be better than the capitalocene in terms of, the way it rolls off your tongue. Anyway, I leave it there and look forward to some comments and critique.
No, I love that last point that you made and that Moore makes about it being the capitalocene rather than the Anthropocene as such, in terms of what we need to be looking at for understanding the degradation of the environment. And this is a point that I've been making for a long time, is that, we have a lot of neo-Malthusians out there, and in other cases, just outright eco-fascists who, they pinpoint the rise of global population as the source of environmental degradation. Whereas anybody that takes more than, 30 seconds to think about it should be able to understand that it's not the growth of global population as such that's contributing to environmental degradation, at least to a large extent. It is capitalism as a system that's contributing to environmental degradation, particularly in production and consumption. And we know that it's not the production and consumption in the global economy is not spread equally amongst people in the globe. Therefore, we know that raw growth and global population is not necessarily going to contribute to climate change in the way and environmental degradation in the way that we think that it does. It's the overproduction and overconsumption of commodities, particularly when these commodities are produced in environmentally destructive ways and use environmentally resource heavy materials. That's really the problem that we have. But that's just my comment on that. I know that we've been going for a while, but there's at least one more topic that I'm really hoping that we have time to spend some time on, which is hegemony. I think that discussing hegemony in the context of the conversation that we're having right now is quite important. And the role of hegemony is something that we've been discussing in previous episodes of the show. Listeners, if you're interested in those specific episodes, I can think of at least two recent ones where we were talking about hegemony, which was our most recent episode with Emmanuel Ness, where we talked about the potential role of China as a counter-hegemon to the United States, as well as our crossover episode with journalist Danny Haifong, where we were talking about the U.S.'s hegemony and potentially the end of U.S. hegemony. And Adnan, I know that you also have been talking about hegemony on the Red Nation. I had listened to both parts of that conversation that our friends at the Red Nation released with you, where you were talking about hegemony as well, particularly in the second part of that conversation. So listeners, if you want to check out those conversations, that's where you can find them. But Professor Salzmann, to turn it into this conversation, hegemony plays a really big role in the understanding of world systems. It plays a really big role in the understanding of capitalism writ large. And I know we've already discussed whether thinking about capitalism as a system as such is historically relevant or not. But I think that understanding hegemony and coming to grips with how hegemony and rivalry changes over periods of history is really important to understanding history. So without putting, closing the question in really any way, let me leave it nice and open for you to address the role of hegemony in this conversation that we've been having and any commentary that you would like to have about hegemony.
This allows me to give a plug for one of my favorite historians, who's also a pre-modern historian, Frederick Chapin Lane, F.C. Lane, who's the great Venetian scholar of Venetian history. And he's also, people don't give him credit as such. I mean, Charles Tilly, the great historical sociologist, used his work extensively in writing his book, or the beginnings of his origin of his book, Coercion, Capital, and European States. And I think what Lane has taught us that we still have yet to take wholly into the economic history realm is the role of power and the way that power translates into profits. And of course, what he was looking at was sea power and the way that the Venetian Navy was able to control at least part of the Adriatic for part of the time, and that basically you had this economy of scale that was created by sea that you couldn't replicate on land. You needed less people to control it. You could extract surplus in the form of customs or movement of goods without paying taxes, et cetera, et cetera. And he talks about the profits from power. And that, I think, is a discussion that we need to have more about in terms of what hegemony is. And the way that hegemony, in terms of military hegemony as an economic force in the world, is being transformed, of course, as we speak. And what I usually end, the book I end with in my course is Shoshana Zuboff's new book called Surveillance Capitalism. And so I think this whole dynamic is radically changing what we mean by hegemony. It's also radically changing what we mean by space. So participation, control, and we know, how the internet may be controlled or shut off and channeled. So, and how, all the internet, and a lot of it is just a spin-off or in tandem with the military-industrial complex. They are working together. So it's becoming, it is this seamless thing. But on the other side, and this is something, is that hegemony has changed. And my example here, something that is very painful to me personally, I mean, because I have friends from the region, it's very painful to me as and still American citizen whose tax dollars and whose government destroyed that country several times over again, is what we see happening in Afghanistan. That I think the new hegemony is very different than the Cold War hegemony, the old Cold War, not the new Cold War. The new Cold War hegemony is very different. Yes, there are troops on the ground, there are tanks facing off, but there's also this way in which whole parts of the world can be written off. In the old Cold War, hegemony had to have boots on the ground. The new Cold War, it's not necessary, and entire spaces can be left, Libya, Somalia, of course, Afghanistan can be left in total destruction. And the populations can be written off. They don't count. So hegemony has reconstructed itself on several new axes, both extractive. I mean, the West and the East or wherever will make, pathways, hegemonic pathways into Afghanistan if it's a question of extracting resources. They'll build a little corridor, right? A belt in road across Asia that can be selective and assert hegemony. But it's changing. It produces a profit and a rent. That's what F.C. Lane talked about, that power produces a rent. And it produces it in different ways. And the technologies of coercion and control change, and that's part of it. What's interesting in this era, however, if I can just continue on that line, is how hegemony is to some degree detached from economic dominance, and how the U.S., which spends more than the next 100 nation states in military, is also declining economic power. I'm not saying that China isn't building up its army or that Russia hasn't continued. China has more than a million, and India as well in terms of their soldiers. But this disjuncture, I think, may be unique in history. Maybe I don't know British, whether we can compare it with British, but I think these are the kind of analyses and comparisons that should be happening. If we're really talking about understanding where we can transform the system.
Well, I think you're absolutely right, Ariel. I'm so glad you brought it to that kind of analysis of what's changing in the contemporary system of global hegemony, because I do think many of these economic historians have, I think, noted that this is a pretty unique situation. I think Michael Hudson, for example, had some line I saw recently from one of his works about how we are in a very strange era where this is the first attempt at imposing a kind of global hegemonic order by a power that is a total debtor power and has very weak economic bases on most what we would consider the industrial or other kind of commercial measures, that it's a declining kind of economic power in various ways, but that the way the hegemony is working is with these new kind of technologies, a changed sort of geography, all of those things that you referenced in terms of the internet and the intersection with military and surveillance, is that that this is a hegemony that has leveraged very high into its military power as the only mechanism for maintaining a kind of coercive capacity to structure a world system that allows its debt, in trade and consumer debt, etc., to sort of float, life. You mentioned, a middle class person with these inflated housing, values is considered a kind of millionaire. This is all a kind of projection of a system, it seems, where U.S. military advantage and the fact that it is invested in one area, really, which is surveillance, military power, and military technology, and where it only has one decisive advantage over its competitors is that kind of long historical, maybe, some people have read Lane and they figured, well, this is the only way we can keep going, is we invest in the one area where we can get the rents of empire, through power, military power, and so on. So that, I think you're right, that is a unique kind of situation. So the prospects for how that could be unraveled will be interesting. We did talk with Emmanuel Ness about precisely this question of China as an emerging counter hegemon, potentially what that will do to the structure of the way the U.S. has bargained or gambled on its dominance. It hasn't done it through, changing its economy in some new productive ways, or, it's just done it in the most unproductive way, which is, military power, military technology, and trying to exert influence that way. So I think that is, and I think the other point that I really want to ask you to maybe expand a little bit on is exactly that, about surplus populations in the global geography. Is that, used to be that they would be a reserve army of labor somehow, but that's not the case now. These are, and I've seen other analyses that talk about surplus populations, essentially, that they are just quarantined and their fate has nothing, no concern in the overall calculus. And with these sanctions regimes that we see, is that the imposition and just what Biden just did with Afghanistan, in terms of seizing and deciding to distribute some of Afghanistan's reserves, money that belongs to the Afghan people, but that they can quarantine a whole country through a sort of sanctions regime, and then expropriate, their wealth and resources that happen to be, yeah, exactly. So anyway, I just wondered if you had more that you might want to say about how that's working.
I think one has to read Lane again to understand that relationship, because basically, it's U.S. overreach that's, building up China, really. China is the main beneficiary of this, as perceived as an alternative, but also repressing some of the populations that, China would have to do anyway, I think one of the reasons that, that the U.S. could walk away from Afghanistan is it because it's left it on the border with Russia and former Soviet Central Asia and China. It's a little border up there with China. It's your problem now, folks. We're just going to dump this mess that we created, and the surplus population. But one of the other things that's happening, and that has accelerated tremendously during the pandemic, is the mechanization of production all over the world. And the same industries that were, taking advantage of these huge scale in China of production, for example, German industries, are all moving back to Germany now, and without the workers. So, where they required 100,000 workers in China, and they could get them, and the factories were built up overnight, in those miraculous, dynamic ways of building in China, and they're all broken down and they're moved back. And now, the sneaker companies and everybody else has these huge halls filled with machines and 5 workers. So this is happening at a very fast clip because of the pandemic. and because of the precariousness of, of labor, because they get sick now, they get pandemics, they get diseases. So yeah, this is what's also happening at the same time, that the surplus populations, quote unquote, are being produced outside, but also inside. It's and the Bezos and the Musks are, circling the globe in their new spaceships.
Yeah, well, they're
not fiddling, but
that film Elysium, I don't know if you've seen that film.
I haven't seen it.
Oh, well, I mean, it kind of gets at exactly that, where you have environmental devastation in the world, and the elite has relocated to this kind of orbiting space area where, they might use some of the people from below when they need them, but most of the time they're just there suffering in their miserable, situation. And,
that's the new gated community.
Exactly. Right? It was like
did you see that film Wild Palms? Did you ever see that? That was
no, I didn't.
Yes, it was a version of this. So, but on Earth.
But yeah, it's sort of like a stellar gated community kind of situation. Yeah, no. In any case, but I think, I don't know, Henry, if you have anything you want to add at this point, but I thought those were very important conclusions to bring this kind of analysis of the history of capitalism to being able to appreciate some of the shifts and changes in our contemporary environment and circumstance.
Oh, for sure. And I've really enjoyed the conversation, and I feel like I've gotten a lot out of it, and it stimulated a lot of thoughts, both in terms of my preparation for the interview really got me thinking about a lot of things in the conversation itself. So why don't we conclude by going around the horn one more time with just briefly either, final thoughts that the conversation stimulated, or whatever happens to be on our mind right now, or whatever we want the listeners to get as a takeaway, however you want to wrap up. So I guess I'll go first then. Adnan, you can follow me, and Professor Salzmann, you can have the final word as we wrap up here. So my closing thoughts on this is that, listeners, I think that we need to understand that whether you think, as Samir Amin does, that politics and ideology are the motive force of global history, or whether you think Andre Gunther Frank is more correct with his capital accumulation as the driving force of global history, I think that what we need to understand is that regardless of what's driving history, that history is interconnected. History has these connections. We have this system. Whether or not you would consider yourself a systems theorist or a dependency theorist, we have to understand that history does have these connections, and that without understanding these connections and understanding how various states, in some cases, or sometimes extra state powers, sometimes within states, how they are able to use and abuse other countries, other states, other groups of people in the world, that oftentimes is what allows us to really understand how history is moving, and also allows us to understand perhaps how we can try to affect history going forward. By understanding the connections of the world, by understanding how capital is connected in the world system, we are able to better understand how we can try to push beyond the system that we're currently in. And I know that this is something that we had talked about earlier. Adnan, this is a point that you had been bringing up, is when we're looking at there being a global system, and as Gunther Frank would say, a 5,000-year global system, and as the other systems theorists would say, 500-year global system, at times it seems like overwhelming, right? We're in this 500 to 5,000 year global system. And I don't think that anybody that's listening to the program is really satisfied with the system that we're currently living in. But we have to understand the connections within the world in order to understand where we can push, what buttons we should push, how to make a more just world, and how to make a more just system. So those are just some of the things that were pinging around in my head as we have this conversation, is that, people just need to understand this, and they need to look at it from this perspective, because this is not the perspective that you get when you read, your high school history textbooks where everything is very isolated history events. We don't have this interconnectedness of history. So that's just the things that were bouncing around my head. Adnan, any final thoughts from you?
Well, I think we've had a pretty thorough conversation, so I don't have too much more, to add about it other than that, I think what I'll be thinking about as a consequence of this conversation and preparing for it a little bit is to think a little bit more about how to appreciate and study some, what Janet Abu-Lughod, who we didn't talk about, but is a key figure in these debates and who wrote a wonderful book before European hegemony about the kind of 13th century epoch of the world system as she saw it, is the way in which you can't just study one region in isolation and understand something that you were just alluding to, Henry, but is to think about how these processes are interactive and how a non-Western perspective rebalances our understanding and appreciation better of the changes that take place in history. So I'm going to definitely be thinking a little bit more about that and about that particular moment, since that's the era I study. And I want to go back to kind of thinking about, how do you integrate the histories and stories of interchange, of intersection, of interaction at all these levels of culture, politics, and economy in the wider Mediterranean world, and how that's just one node within a wider Afro-Eurasian system during that period, and how that might change our perspective. So that's something that I'll take out of this conversation. But I think the last point is just where we ended up in our conversation, and where is kind of thinking about what's happening in our current world. And what narratives and analyses we need really to grasp this. And that's one thing that I think is really beneficial from a longer period of examination and a wider geography, is that then we can appreciate those agents and causes, in our own time, I think, in a more sophisticated way, which is, I think, what we're going to need, since I think, as Ariel mentioned earlier, clearly our previous analysis had flaws because it didn't lead to the kinds of changes we hoped for, expected, and so we have to rethink some of, that's what's known, is that if capitalism is an appropriate kind of frame of analysis, it's clearly a dynamic system that has been changing, and our analysis of it and of the world that we're inhabiting has to be updated as well. And frankly, we don't have a lot of time to do it. We were talking about environmental factors, and that's been one problem of the analysis before, is that these are not externalities. So we need an integrated way of thinking, because time is short. History may be long, but our future could be short. So we have to rethink this thoroughly and effectively if we're to find avenues for our social struggles now and in the near future.
I want to thank both of you, because I'm teaching this course right now, but my students don't have the same frame of reference that you do or your audience does. So it's a very nice, refreshing way for me to retool and rethink what I'm doing with them and what I'm doing with my course. But I think one of the things I want to end with, and I do teach also courses on commodity, on history, not the history of commodity, the history of commodification, really, and consumerism as an ideology and as a definition of these classes that have come into being as a sort of byproduct of, the way that capitalism reinvents itself and allows for a slightly larger group of people to have what they seem to be sharing in the benefits, is that I think this is a very important awareness that we have to have of the role of these classes that have been brought into this relationship with capital and their role, that it becomes, and I'm not talking about, every consumer is an agent of change, or that, if you buy, one pair of Tom's shoes, sorry if I'm citing a commercial product, that two other people will benefit somewhere in the world, in the global South. but I think there has to be an awareness, because this is now the strategy, really. I mean, this is China's strategy. I'm sure Russia has a very similar into building up a middle class. Nationalism is part of it, but it's also part of a creating of a larger web of complicity in sustaining this system. It's larger than it's ever been. It's not smaller. I mean, the working class is smaller. The people who are discarded are, from the system are smaller. But there's an ever larger group of people who are linked into the system in a way that they think is beneficial for them. It's sustaining certain lifestyles, and that it continues to grow. And I think we have to think about the role that beyond a small elite play in sustaining the system, and the ideologies, including nationalism, that work to dissimulate the sort of effects, or conceal the effects, which are ultimately going to affect 99% of the world population, human and non-human. So I would just end it there, and perhaps start thinking about agency again. What is agency in this age in different ways?
Yeah, as I said before, I absolutely love the conversation, and hopefully we can bring you back at some point in the future to talk with you again, because like I said, every time that I've heard you speak, I've really enjoyed the conversations that you've been a part of. So it would be an honor and a pleasure to have you back on in the future.
Yes.
So listeners, we're going to wrap up this conversation. Again, our guest was Professor Ariel Salzmann, who is a historian at Queen's University, alongside, of course, our host, Adnan Husain. Professor Salzmann, can you tell the listeners anything that you would like them to direct them to, so that they can follow you or your work?
I'm sort of limited interface with the internet, but my current work is going in a variety of directions, and I should have a book out with Hearst, and we'll have economic content, but it's mainly going to be focused on the history of exclusion in the West, and how it is part of the political and economic system, which we now have as global system. So that's one thing, but I would encourage people to read something that I didn't write, but I wish I had, which is Raj Patel's and Jason Moore's A History of the World in 7 Cheap Things, because I think it encapsulates a lot of the new thinking about what capitalism is and what it's done on so many different levels.
Excellent. I hope that you're prepared for the fact that when your book is coming out, that we will be back in touch with you about coming back on. So be prepared for that.
Thank you.
Adnan, how can the listeners find you and all of the work that you're doing?
Well, you can follow me on Twitter at Adnan A. Husain, Husain, and you can also listen to the other podcast I host, and we've had Ariel Salzmann on as a frequent guest on it, called The Majlis, Majlis. And if you're interested in the Middle East, Islamic world, Muslim diasporas, Islamophobia, those kinds of questions and concerns are our regular fare there. And I just want to add my hearty thanks to Ariel for coming on and being generous with her time to talk about these important issues that she's so well versed in, teaching and reading in this area about the history of capitalism. And I agree completely. Hopefully we can have you on again sometime real soon.
Thank you. Thank you.
And listeners, you can find me on Twitter at Huck1995. That's HUCK1995. You can follow the show on Twitter at Guerrilla_pod, GUERRILLA_pod. That's how you can best keep up with what we're producing and putting out, as well as from each of the co-hosts, what we're individually doing as well. So be sure to follow Guerrilla_pod on Twitter. If you would like to support the show monetarily, which helps us keep the lights on for our little production here. After all, we are completely independent and entirely beholden to you, the listeners. You can support us by going to patreon.com/Guerrilla History. Again, Guerrilla being spelled GUERRILLA. Until next time, listeners, solidarity.